Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host Sana Maqbool with you at PTV World. In today's show, we will be taking a look at two very important stories that concern Pakistan. The first is with reference to DG ISPR's press conference in which he spoke about how dragging army into politics is not something that is in the country's favor. This is something that the DG ISPR and the army institutions have spoken about earlier as well. They have repeatedly said that they are not involved in the political decisions of the country, neither do they want to be involved in the political discussions of the country as well. And the DG ISPR has also specified that recently there have been intensified and deliberate attempts to drag Pakistan armed forces and the leadership in the ongoing political discourse in the country. He has also spoke about how the Pakistan armed forces take strong exception to such unlawful and unethical practice and expect all to abide by the law and keep the armed forces out of political discourse in the best interest of the country. This is a statement by the DG ISPR which clarifies what needs to be done about it and how the army is taking exceptions to recent incidents where such statements have been made which point towards the army's involvement or are defamatory and have clarified that this is not in favor of the country and something that does not need to be done. However, what remains to be discussed is, of course, the way that we're going to be moving forward and how this discourse is going to change, considering what has happened on social media in the recent past as well, especially after the ouster of the previous Prime Minister. And then, of course, the kind of narratives that have been circulating around the country, what needs to be done about it, how it's going to be curtailed and responded to, and then how exactly are we going to move forward, where we understand that such discourse is, of course, not in favor of the country, and then how it's going to impact our relationship with other countries as well, and then, of course, our role in the international arena. This is going to be our topic for the first segment of the show. Our second segment is going to focus on the economic situation of the country, which is also something we've discussed a lot previously as well. We've talked about how, when the government changed, this is one of the biggest challenges for the current government, and Pakistan continues to witness a drop in the rupee as well against the dollar, and we've seen that this is something that, of course, is going to be damaging for the country in the long run. Whether or not we're going to see any change in that, we're going to try and understand and also look at what remains of the IMF program. How are we going to proceed? Are we getting something soon from countries such as Saudi Arabia as well, because much was expected from the recent visit of the Prime Minister to that country as well, and whether or not subsidies such as on petroleum products will be given by the government to take care of the situation. So that will be our focus in the second segment of the show today. As always, I've been joined in the studio by Farrukh Pitafi and Raja Faisal, and for our first segment, I've been joined online by Brigadier Retired Mr. Rashid Wali Janjoy, President APRI, and I've also been joined by Ahmed Jawad, who's leader PMLN. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining us in the debate. I'll start with you, Brigadier Janjoy. When we look at what has been happening with reference to statements being made or pointed towards the army's involvement into political matters of the country, we've seen that DG ISPR has repeatedly clarified that this is not something that the army has been involved in or is interested to be involved in, and that it is not in favor of Pakistan in any case that the army institutions are involved in the political matters of the country. However, despite that, we've seen that many references have been made, particularly by certain political parties. We've seen in the aftermath of the ouster of the previous Prime Minister Imran Khan, this was something that was this narrative that was also propagated. An entire campaign was also run on social media, which then, of course, had to be curtailed and investigated into. But then when we look at the kind of direction that perhaps this narrative is taking, and in the way that a lot of political parties or people in general are also following suit, how do you propose that we emphasize this point that Pakistan, this is not something that is in Pakistan's favor and needs to be stopped?
Answer to your question is that it is not at all in Pakistan's interest that any institution is dragged into politics. We see Pakistan's history in which there have been criticisms on army's repeated interventions in politics, but we have come a long way. Now, when the army is on the right side of the constitution and has explicitly stated on a number of times that we have got nothing to do with politics, the attempts to, drag it into politics are not acceptable at all. The selective and misleading invocation of historical references in one of the former PM's addresses, referring to Sirajuddaullah's Salar simile, I think it is inflammatory and mischievous. The use of word neutral in pejorative terms is scurrilous, defamatory, and insightful. These floodgates of vituperative utterances are going to impress the acolytes and politically charged activists who are ready to suspend disbelief and consume conspiracy narrative hook, line, and sinker. But any sane person would disbelieve this thing because if democracy is denuded of decency and its essential ingredients like consensus, accommodation, it degenerates into an autocracy. Now, we must show respect for the institutions, not only armed forces, but judiciary also, and through innuendos, through insinuations, and clever by half similes and references. Any satire aimed at institution corrodes the very basis of our constitutional edifice. And I think I couldn't emphasize more that this is a very harmful trend that needs to be arrested as soon as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Brigadier Saab, we've seen that the DG ISPR also has explicitly said that the army is making an exception out of this, of what has been happening and the statements that have come out. Does this mean that we can expect, or are we going to see perhaps a stricter response from the institutions if such practice continues? Because a lot of the narratives that we're discussing, the political party, perhaps their popularity or their entire narrative, is sort of dependent on saying these things, especially BTS.
You see, these accusations of treachery against institutions, it gets fillip due to anonymity of digital platforms that frees the trolls from fear of retribution. The foreign conspiracy trending on Twitter that goes on for weeks without a frisson and without a shred of evidence, I think will make us a laughing stock in the world community. These conspiracy theories which are being peddled with such gay abandon need to be put at the touchstone of reality through informed discourses, and I think there's a need of a very strong counter narrative, and that narrative should be based on reality check, basic facts, and should be disseminated through all social media platforms so as to debunk the steady stream of calumny, mendacity, and all kind of lies.
All right. Emma Jawad, when we look at the situation and specifically the reference to neutrality, which has been made time and again, and the former Prime Minister has also been saying things with reference to that. We understand that whenever we talked about the democratic institutions of the country flourishing and democratic principles flourishing, we talked about how we need to be able to have independent politics and not involvement of any institutions within the political matters of the country. Isn't this neutrality something that we have aspired towards, or is something that is encouraging for democracy? How is this derogatory?
Sana, this is a very delicate subject, especially under the current circumstances, and I would like to give you a very detailed answer, and I would request for your patience so that I can explain the background, the status, the impact, and what should we do about this. First of all, we must accept the fact that there has been involvement of military in the past history of Pakistan. And there have been many questions about that. But when military establishment decides to be neutral, and not only by words, they prove it with their actions, I think, first of all, it should be welcomed. that military is permitting the political institution to come forward and take their own space without crutches, without guidance, without infiltrations, without influence, without interference. So, first of all, it should be welcomed. But now, what happened when the military goes neutral? We had a government. As soon as we saw the military going neutral, first of all, their own allied parties, they started leaving that government. And it is not by design, by anything from the military. It is because that Imran Niazi and his government could not attach, inspire, unite the allied parties with them in the national policies. And they did not agree with the policies of the PTI government. So they started leaving. Secondly, second impact was that within the party, there were internal rifts. I was also part of that. And we have seen a large number of MNAs and MPA from PTI who started abandoning the party. Again, it has nothing to do with any military design or anything, but it is the impact of the going neutral. And then we are not talking about the worst inflation, the worst governance, the worst economy, the worst foreign policy. I'm just talking about the impact of military going neutral. Now, how PTI government
and
and
Sahab, I
PTI
understand
leadership,
that, but when we talk about neutrality, we've talked about these statements, and they have been made in clear reference to the institutions, and because of that, the kind of impact that it's having is damaging. My question is, when we look at these statements, why do you think that they are being used in such a way?
yes. Now, that's an important question, and that was the second part of my conversation. After having received this impact, obviously, PTI leadership, they felt very insecure. And to put the blame of their poor performance, or to put the blame of not being able to keep their party intact, to put the blame of not keeping the allied parties with them, they started blaming the military. So that was the reason that instead of their own poor performance, accepting that, they started putting the blame on military. Now, what is happening?
All right, I understand that.
If we just take the statement
All
of
right,
Imran Khan.
Sahab, I'll come back to you, and I understand the reasons.
Sana, let me complete, because if you ask the question,
actually we have
and
to
such
go to
a
other
delicate
analysts
question,
as well.
you should
It's a
allow me
discussion.
to complete my talk.
All right.
The Imran Khan Niazi statement that I knew this happening since July 2021, and DGISI is my eyes and ear. So what kind of culture he wants to introduce in this country, which is not coming from the military. It is coming from the political leader of a party, that he is expecting DGSI to act as his eyes and ears to keep his majority in the parliament. So you must understand the intention behind such maligning of military, because it is because of their own insecurity. Now, what is happening is that with this kind of maligning and blaming the military establishment, Pakistan is not in a position to have such kind of fault lines, such kind of misunderstandings and confusion in the national narrative or among the public, on the media or on the social media. It can create serious cracks in the national integrity. And it is very important that we must act, whether it is giving a warning or whether it is using the law of the land to discourage such trends. It cannot be just watched and left them that they can do whatever they want.
All right, Ahmed Sahab, let's talk a little bit more about that as well, because I want to understand what sort of a response can be given, or perhaps what direction we need to take to curtail that. But before that, Farrukh, I want to talk a little bit more about the impact that this statement or such statements have. We understand, of course, it's not in Pakistan's favor, and we have strived hard to perhaps be in a situation where we can say and talk about how the political decisions in the country is separate from any influence by the army or any other institutions. Do you think that the statements that are being given with regards to neutrality being something which is discouraging or something that is not apt for anyone to go for is something that is damaging the way that people are looking at how army institutions need to act in this country, or what their role is, or how the political matters of the country need to go ahead?
Right, Sana, I'm a student of history and I'm a student also of geopolitics. So I want to agitate 2 or 3 very important points.
Okay.
First of all, we need to learn from the experiences of our neighbors. Recently, we have seen that Sri Lanka is going through hell. Afghanistan has already been sent to hell in a handbasket. And India's condition is also not improving, right? With that kind of politics in this region, where everyone seems to have their own facts, not merely their opinion, things become really murky, and we should be actually concerned about what is happening within our country. Being an institutionalist, it has been my concern that for past 15 years at least, army has been trying really hard to stay away from politics. Remember that in this country, half the time the country was ruled by a military dictator. But now when this institution is staying away, and when it is fighting terrorism, when it is trying to stabilize the country,
Right.
it becomes really dangerous and bad for anybody to actually try to malign anyone within the forces. And this is what I've been saying during the previous government, when the current government, when it was opposition, was saying these things, and this is exactly I'm going to say now as well. At this moment, it seems that Imran Khan Saab doesn't even read the books he claims he has read. For example, William Dalrymple's beautiful, well-researched book, Anarchy, about East India Company, actually documents Siraj-ud-Dawla and all these characters that he mentioned. Right? They all were villains if you read the history, and you will know that they were never for the people. And yet, somehow, we start comparing Mir Jafar with current leadership. With due respect, there wasn't any standing army back then. There wasn't an institution of sacrifice. And Pakistan army, right from its leader, its head, to the Sipahi who actually fights on the streets, all of these people have sacrificed enough that we can never question their loyalty to the country. And look who's talking. People who cannot even prove their own cases, should they be actually agitating any leader of the country in that way? This is heartbreaking. I think at this moment, all leaders need to understand that state's power, compared to the 2 countries that I mentioned, Sri Lanka and Afghanistan, Pakistani state is very powerful. If it doesn't assert itself, it is because it respects democracy and institution building. But if this is going to continue, I can assure you that when a pushback comes, then nobody will be able to stand their ground.
Right.
This is the time to evade such negative trends and stand for the state of the Pakistan and stand for Pakistaniyat.
Absolutely. Faisal, I'd just like to take your comment as well on the situation, and you can proceed your question later. When we look at the impact, of course, that such narratives have, they leave an impression or perhaps influence people's opinions and the way that they look at certain institutions or certain personalities as well. And a lot of people who have certain loyalties to political parties or have a certain perspective and they've supported certain parties have it difficult to believe otherwise what is being told to them. And even though one should of course be able to exercise their critical faculties, but when we look at the way that the opinion is being influenced, how do you think that the institutions such as the army or even the new governance is going to be able to shape the way that people are thinking or perceiving the army institutions and their role in the political matters of the country?
You know, I would agree with Brigadier Janjua that narratives they need to give the counter narratives as soon as possible, because this is the best way to go along the things. Because I know whatever is going on in today's date, it is highly demoralizing for the armed forces, for the institutions, and we need to understand that there are certain journalists as well who are talking about the promotions, talking about the transfers of important corps commanders, and them corps commanders are actively actually fighting war on terror right now, and one of them of course is of 11 Corps, and his name is being taken as well in political speeches, which is very wrong. Which is very wrong. Plus, his name is once again being taken by a few journalists, especially in concerns related to, oh, he is getting transferred and he will be, helping out in coming up dharnas and all of that. This must end now, because everyone needs to understand that Pakistan Army is a professional army. It has distanced itself from the politics, and of course they will never be interfering anymore, and that interference would never be seen in coming future. Coming to the question of whether Imran Khan, he claimed that obviously ears and eyes of the Prime Minister or him.
Right.
I think he talked about a time when he was a Prime Minister. Fair enough, he can say that ears and eyes of the Prime Minister of that time. Then he must understand that in today's time, of course, somebody else is Prime Minister, and if an institution comes under him, especially an intelligence institution, then of course that intelligence institution needs to be and is the ears and eyes of the government, for the sake of betterment of the government, for the sake of driving the nation out of the internal as well as the external turmoil, and not for the political gains or anything of such nature. If you allow me, I have a question for Brigadier Janjua.
Can I very quickly actually intervene here? Just very quick intervention regarding the media. And I'm apolitical. I'm not associated with any political party. My only concern, and regardless whosoever says it, my concern is stop actually cutting down the tree on which you are sitting. You are talking about the state of Pakistan, your institution. You shouldn't be undermining them. Secondly, regarding media and pundits, about time our Pakistani state actually reevaluates its media policy of past 20 years. Most of the talking heads that you see on television, they are just spreading poison, regardless of which side of divide you are in. It is really frightening, because in the war on terror, these people were supposed to stand with the state of Pakistan. But what we saw was either they would not cooperate or they would actively undermine the state of Pakistan. We need a new media policy where people who actually serve this country well are promoted. It is the standard all over the world. Why shouldn't it be here?
Exactly. And one very important question from obviously Brigadier Janjua, sir. I have been appearing on Indian channels, and I know the fact that their ultimate goal is that people of Pakistan, in their hearts, the respect they have for the institutions like Pakistan Army, they don't want to see that in the hearts of people of Pakistan. Right now, if we see someone who's very happy, is the Indian channels, who is very happy is the Indian themselves. Their institutions are very happy that Pakistan Army, obviously it's losing that strength which they always used to claim. I just wanted to know from you that shouldn't it be the time for all of the political parties, for all of the journalists across the board to understand that whatever they are doing, it is actually very demoralizing for the institutions, number one, and number two is serving the purpose of the enemy. Isn't it the time that they need to understand this?
I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's about time they understood that public opinion, in fact, is a new principle of war. We are taught many principles of wars in war colleges and staff colleges, but this public opinion has emerged as a new principle of war, and whosoever subverts the loyalty of populace and its love towards armed forces is in fact playing into the hands of enemy. This concept of political neutrality is to be celebrated and not to be spoken in pejorative terms. Somebody in France said something derogatory about Jean-Paul Sartre, and the reply was that, look, we cannot jail Sartre because France is Sartre. Here, a wedge is being drawn between the armed forces, rank and file, and its leadership. They must understand that the Chief of Army Staff, he is the repository of the honor, of respect. Army is stratified rank-wise, but ethos-wise, it is a monolith which believes in one ideology, which believes in one motivational ethos, and it's solidly united, being a very, very disciplined army. But once a continual cacophony of such propaganda is directed no less than a former prime minister and its acolyte, they start echoing like an echo chamber, and those messages, they get magnified, and this noise it doesn't subvert the loyalty, but it does create a lot of problems, and it pleases the cockles of the hearts of Indians no end. And I would like to point out here that there is a need to lay down a clear code of conduct for the politicians, regardless of the political divide, not to drag any armed forces personnel or any element thereof into the politics for populist politics as an ideologue to play to the gallery and to score few political brownie points. I think it's about time we put an end to this thing through a clearly enunciated code of conduct for politicians as well as the media personnel.
Right. Brigadier Saab, I'm glad you talked about the institution as a concept as well, because a lot of what has been done is perhaps also to separate the person from the institutions. A lot of what was said previously was targeted to a certain individual, and the institution as a whole was perhaps left out of it. And I understand the reasoning behind it perhaps, but when we look at the way it impacts the institution itself, perhaps the entire sanctity of the institution that we're all talking about is still being preserved by people who are still being callous in this way, but they are perhaps causing even more damage when they only target a certain individual. How are we going to protect the sanctity of individuals within the institutions as well?
And discipline, how do you reassert discipline?
I think the institution takes care of that itself, because institution is quite disciplined. What we need to lay down certain red lines for journalists as well as the politicians who are playing these politics and who are sending these messages. There is a very clear line that distinguishes calumny from criticism. This needs to be respected, and the institutional sanctity needs to be protected through these clearly disseminated guidelines for the media as well as the political leadership. And it is the job of the government. DG ISPR need not come each and every time to defend himself, because as an institution, army needs to stay away from this rough and tumble of politics. It is the job of the government's media machinery, and of all the media responsible journalists.
Absolutely. And Brigadier Saab, that's an interesting point, and I want to take Jawad Saab's take on that as well, since we're almost out of time for this segment. Jawad Saab, when we look at the situation, you earlier also talked about how perhaps a more stricter response needs to be given, and if not, then the law needs to be taken into their hands as well. I want you to perhaps also clarify on what sort of a law are we actually looking at, what are the legal implications of such statements that are being made, and what course can be taken with regards to that. And then what Brigadier Saab was talking about of how perhaps the army institutions need not themselves respond, and it is the government who can play a role of making sure that the sanctity of the institutions is preserved.
So now, first of all, we must understand that the perception today is very different than the perception in the past. If yesterday we had few thousand media houses, means few thousand media houses with their mics and with their pen. But today we are talking about 120 million people using the digital space. And we don't know each one of them. Which one is fake, which one is hostile, which one is having some agenda. So the perception challenge has grown many, many folds. And if 120 million people are not guided, or they are not properly trained, or they are not properly regulated and controlled, I think there is going to be a flood, just like a water flood, which can wipe out anything in its way. We need to control this digital media. And for this, there should be certain regulations. We cannot allow people not with enough education, not with proper guidance. And uh, if you might have noticed, a 13 or 14 years old girl who has been pitched by her parents. Imagine what kind of society we are heading into. And she is talking about the military institution. She is criticizing. Do you think that she has that qualification, that she understands what is a military institution, what is the role of military institution? And then she is made to talk about it. And then a political leader is encouraging that. So this kind of trend has to be controlled, has to be contained. And I agree with Brigadier Saab that the national narrative is the responsibility of the ruling government. It is not the responsibility of the military. Yes, we have a very effective ISPR team, media team, who are always there to take care of, to support the national narrative. Not take care because it's not their responsibility, but they are well trained to support the national narrative. But it does not mean that the government can put the weight of the national narrative on the military. It has to be taken care by the government. And
Absolutely.
today there is
Absolutely.
much more
Ahmed
need
Jawad
than
Sahab,
ever
thank you
in our
very
history.
much. We're almost out of time. Thank you very much, Ahmed Jawad Sahab, for joining us, and Brigadier Rashid Waleed for joining us as well. Farrukh, you may add something. We don't have time to
I
question
very
our guests.
quickly want to add
Yes.
this thing about regulating the space, right? This is a huge problem that you have to understand. Our problem so far has been either try to control the supply. If you cannot do it, then curtail the demand, right? That is how things have been functioning. But you have to understand the overall infrastructure, how things were created is the problem. For example, when you talk about these fake accounts, various other things, from PTA to intelligence agencies, you honestly think that nobody knows where these troll farms are and who's actually running them and how many accounts they might have. I think everybody knows it, right? Regarding television and media, why is it the worst performers, the people who insult, the people who swear on air, they get the highest rating? Because when it comes to dating system, there's a monopoly. There's only one company that actually regulates all their rating system. Break that monopoly and then empower PTA to take stock of whosoever is exploiting. You can curtail the infrastructure issues, and by doing that, you don't need to restrict the space. You just have to ensure that more merit prevails.
Yeah,
Yes.
you know, Sana, I just wanted to mention another thing. If we look at, if we go through the narratives which we are talking about, majority of the social media handles, they are being handled outside of the country. They could be obviously overseas Pakistanis or group of overseas Pakistanis, or they could be Indians as well. I mean, we have precedents in past. Of course, they have been doing it, and who knows that they are doing it right now.
Absolutely.
We have been monitoring that.
Yes.
We actually discussed during the previous government how many trends were created and spread by Indian or Afghan handlers.
Exactly.
That has been happening. But the point is, our institutions are fully capable to understand what is happening and to actually create a more level playing field. Why is it that the YouTube channels which actually spread anarchy gets all the hits and no one who is actually talking sane gets any? Because they are these handlers which are artificially created, which keep on rewarding the worst rule breakers possible.
Absolutely, and perhaps that is where we really need to push back and be able to see what can be done about it. And this, of course, as we've discussed earlier as well, is very damaging for the country. There are, of course, numerous problems that our country is facing, and the economic challenges is one big one as well. Then our second segment is going to focus on the economic challenges with particular reference to where we're heading in terms of course, the rupee and then the IMF packages, and what are we looking at in terms of our relationship with other countries such as Saudi Arabia, and whether or not any relief can be given to the people of Pakistan anytime soon. We of course talked about the way that the government plans to move forward with the economic policies and reforms that are much needed. But Farrukh, when we take a look at the current situation of the country and then the way that the dollar prices keep on rising, we understand that this is something that is contributing tremendously to the prices within the country and the way that our economy is progressing. Can there be something that can be immediately done to be able to help relieve the situation?
Right. I thought that you are going to start with this Pakistan Stock Exchange, which crashed today.
Right.
And I'm going to connect both of them. Regarding Pakistan Stock Exchange, one shouldn't be that much worried at this moment because Morgan Stanley's report is expected on 12th. This is biannual, twice in a year. Report, and that's why the stock exchange can be iffy at times. And so simultaneously, remember, because there is a war going on, which is having an impact on all over the world, economies all over the world, the negative impact is quite visible in the economies of the region as well. For example, India's Sensex and Nifty has been falling for past many days as well. Today there was a little bit upswing, but it was a very small, right, marginal at this moment. Then you look at other countries. For example, Sri Lanka's economy has collapsed already, and we know what exactly is going on. So there are negative trends piling on in this region. Pakistan has to stay boisterous and fight back. Regarding dollar, rupee's valuation or currency's valuation actually bases itself on the valuation of your economy. How good is your economy's or your state's guarantee, right? Because of that, whenever the economy is not doing well, rupee starts sinking, and then you have the current account deficit issue as well. At this moment, it is important to remember that on 18th, we start talking to IMF. There's going to be technical dialogue. And then, of course, regarding Saudi Arabia and UAE, we also expect some kind of intervention. So things are going to look up. My concern at this moment is that for past 4 years, when you talk about finance minister, out of 4 years, 3 years, you had a finance minister who was not elected from the Parliament of Pakistan. The only exceptions are Asad Umar for 8 months, then Azhar Saab's son, he was there for 1 month, and Jahangir Tareen, Shaukat Tareen only was elected to the Senate last December, and within 4 months he was out of job, right? So 3 years out of 4 were non-parliamentarian finance minister. In that situation, Parliament's oversight becomes compromised. We have to do something about that as well.
Absolutely. Let us also welcome in the discussion Dr. Sajid Amin, who's Deputy Executive Director, SDPR. Thank you very much, Dr. Sajid, for joining us in the debate by telephone line. We're talking about, of course, the situation that we see with reference to the rupee and the kind of economic challenges that the country is facing. There are tremendous things that need to be done to improve the situation. And there's a lot of talk about whether or not, with reference to the IMF package, the government is going to proceed towards providing the subsidies against the petroleum products. Do you think this is something that, with reference to the kind of changes that are required or being talked about, is something that we can see sometime soon?
Thank you, Sana. Let me just pick up from one point that my colleague just highlighted, that there is a negative trend going across the globe, actually. And this is true to some extent. But I think the one point that we need to remember in Pakistan is that this Pakistan crisis, economic crisis, is a sort of unique crisis. It's different from other crises that Pakistan has had, for example. I mean, just one point is that this time economic crisis and political crisis are overlapping, actually. I mean, if you compare it with India, well, there is some economic meltdowns going across the globe, but there is a political stability. So in Pakistan, this political instability and political uncertainty is actually sort of hammering the market. Actually, it's creating economic uncertainty in the market, and this is really putting pressure on, on the dollar, on the Pakistan Stock Exchange. So I mean, at one point that you can, around IMF we have been talking. Still, there is there seems to be a confusion going within the government. At one side, there is announcement that there is a huge burden of subsidies that we cannot do with actually. There's 118 billion rupees, for example, on subsidies that we have to go in this month of May. But at the same time, we are not adjusting the prices actually. So this confusion around economic policy, lack of clarity on economic agenda, the clear roadmap. There is no certainty that how long
Right.
the
Dr.
government is
Sajid,
going to stay.
Dr. Sajid, because you're talking about overlapping of the economic and political crises, and then you're also talking about, the subsidies and how to do away with them. Do you think at this moment it is said that if the government is going to remove subsidy from petroleum, things, then it is the price is going to shoot up 80 rupees or 90 rupees? Do you think that what is happening in Sri Lanka is not instructive in this country?
I think we can take it in two ways actually. That what is the cost of not passing these prices onward?
Yeah.
Let's see that we do stick to that we do not pass this price to the consumer. Is it sustainable? It is not sustainable. We may lose the IMF program, and you see what are the costs of losing the IMF program at this point of time. I think Pakistan has to come, the government has to come with a balanced approach. It must pass on, but gradually, number one. And those who are the marginalized, those who are the poor segments of society, they should be protected through social protection program. But Pakistan cannot freeze for these prices for unlimited time, for infinite, because we have a very limited fiscal space. Number two, we may lose IMF program. Number three, global oil prices are sort of rising. They keep rising actually. So this is unsustainable. And I have been writing elsewhere that the cost of keeping the prices freezed are much higher than gradually passing them to the consumer actually. So number one. Yeah. Number two, I think government would try to take it to till June, because this was the initial announcement from the PM's relief package. And I think this is where government is trying to at least take this freeze to the June till budget. And then after that, I think they have some plans to gradually start passing it to the consumer.
Yeah, Dr. Sajid, you've just earlier mentioned about political instability, which is having a toll towards our economy. Can we say that, of course, this political instability is affecting our relations with our other friendly countries as well? And that is why we might not be able to be successful in coming days in our foreign tours. And is it possible that you could give a sort of solution about all of these political insecurities? Could I mention one, and could you say yes or no to it? And that could be the election, or if not election, then at least the date announcement of an election in coming future?
I think this is big assumption that Pakistan is making actually. Let me be very honest with you. There is no guarantee that there will be sort of stabilization after elections, the kind of polarization that we are having. But let me just the point that I am sort of the day one from this government, I am trying to assert is that 2 points are very clearly needed. Number one, government should realize that it has to have its minimum economic agenda, and that should be shared with the market. Market should be taken into confidence that this is our economic agenda that we are trying to implement. Number one. Number two, there should be very clear roadmap that this is how long we are staying. This is how we are approaching this. This is when we are approaching to IMF. For example, there should be very clear announcement if government is trying to take this sort of petrol prices freeze to the June. It can clearly announce that we will start passing by end of June or in the new budget, because it will decrease, it will diffuse that uncertainty that is right now in the market actually, and which is really putting a pressure on stock exchange and the rupee itself. So I think there should be a clear roadmap. You call it election, whatever it is called.
Just a quick question, Dr. Sajid. Do you think that these announcements, if they're actually not met, would still have an overall positive impact? If you announce something right now, even if you're not sure that's going to happen or that's the course you're going to take, overall that's going to still be a positive trajectory?
I think the first I will be aware, and that is why I'm asking it a minimum economic agenda. Government should commit what it can do. Number one. Okay. Number two, the market runs on clarity of thought, clarity of expectations, the sentiment. And if you see when this government came, there was sort of positive sentiment, and that window was very smaller actually. And I think this government, because of this confusion around IMF program, around economic policy, around economic agenda, around its tenure, that is actually creating now a sort of uncertainty and a panic in the market. And this is which is being reflected in both your in stock markets and the pressure on rupee and overall economic activity and the economy overall.
Right. Dr. Zab, very quickly, let me ask you, since earlier you were saying that Pakistan's crisis is unique, and then you said, yes, there is a meltdown elsewhere. But regarding India, all of a sudden, out of $650 billion, $50 billion have been wiped off its foreign currency reserves. So that seemed to me, although they have a humongous cushion, but it is a humongous country as well, that seemed to me quite a setback. Do you think that it is not actually based on the same trend, and this region is actually suffering because of economic situation?
No, I do agree. But when I call it a unique, let me just give you quickly that why do I call it a unique in terms of Pakistan? If you compare it with 2018, for example, balance of payment crisis, there are three things which are different at this point of time. Number one, in 2018, we were entering towards a new government, fresh elections, new government with fresh mandate that we don't have this time actually. This is a very unstable government that we are having. It is still in farming, in making, number one. Number two, at that point, if you see the margin for the policy tweaking was much higher. For example, we had a low interest rate, we had a low inflation, we have a strong rupee. We have a quite opposite at this time. We are touching 12.25 interest rate, 13 point something interest rate. I mean, inflation, rupee is already on 188 roundabout. So number two, the point is that the policy margin of tweaks to interventions is much limited. And number three, in 2018, we have a door open to go to IMF. Yeah. At this point of time, we are actually almost closing, or sort of premature closing the IMF program if we don't go by the commitments that we have made. So this really makes a different situation compared to the crisis that Pakistan had had already previously. So this is when I call it a unique sort of crisis. And this is why, but there's one positive point I think that one we can build on. And this is that the government is willing to listen you. The government is willing to take perceptions, your sort of recommendations. It is engaging with the stakeholders. And I think it should do it on a priority basis with immediate economic agenda, with very clearly conveyed to the market taken into confidence. And I think this can help some sort of positive sentiments in the market.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Sajid Amin, for joining us and being a part of the debate. And we really hope that we can actually look forward to a much better economy and we're able to be able to face the challenges that currently exist. Thank you very much for joining us on the debate. We'll see you tomorrow at 7.